articles. He has compiled an extensive database of 30,000 people living during the 9th and the 10th centuries, and also a second database of Northeast Asian tombs dating back to roughly the 11th century. So both databases are available for download on his website. So as many of my students and colleagues have done. So if you are interested in either one of the databases, I really want to encourage you to visit his website very often and make the best use of his data collection work. So today, we're also happy to have Professor Eric Wang to be our discussant. As usual, we are going to have a 1-hour presentation by the speaker, and then followed by a 15-minute or so discussion by Professor Wang. So Professor Wang got his PhD in politics from Princeton University back in 2020. He has a forthcoming paper in PNAS. So his main research interests center on historical political economy, politics of state building, and bureaucracy. So he also received the Mankey Olson Award for the best dissertation in political economy last year in 2022. Professor Wang currently he is at the Department of Political and Social Change at the Australian National University. So starting this fall, he will join New York University in New York in the US. Okay. So again, just as a quick reminder, if you have any questions, comments, please use the Q&A box. And then at the end of the discussion, my colleague, Professor Zhichen Ma, will take it on and moderate the discussions and the Q&A part of today's webinar. Okay, without further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Tackett.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Chen, and I'm very pleased to be here. I thank Hong Kong University for inviting me. So today I want to say a few words about my use of quantitative prosopography, so specifically my use of these biographical databases in studying Tang and Song history. I will focus mainly on the uses, but I also want to say something about the limitations. I do think that sometimes the data is used in ways that probably are, or that could be somewhat problematic. So I want to point out some of the issues that one should bear in mind. So I will, begin with an introduction of a couple databases and their contents and how they might be used. I'm going to give a few specific examples that are not necessarily all taken from my own work, and then I will dwell in a bit more detail on specific, more recent things that I've worked on. So I'll just begin by mentioning a couple of the prosopographic databases that exist for Chinese history. The better known one is the China Biographical Database, CBDB. A number of important institutions are involved in this project, and it contains a very large data set. One can see on this, according to the most recent web page, that as of August 2022, there's over 500,000 individuals in this database. It's a database that includes data from the Tang, from the Song, and the Ming mostly, although there's also additional material from the Qing and from earlier periods. One of the discussions, one of the projects I've worked on does make use of this data as well as my own data. But I want to point out that this is a database that makes use of material from different periods collected by different people from different sorts of sources, and it can lead to certain issues that one should bear in mind. If one just talks about the Tang and Song sources, I'll point out that most of the Tang material, Tang biographic material, in fact, comes from my own data, and I'll describe that data in just a second. And then the Song sources come from a number of different places. At the core of the original data was data compiled by Robert Hartwell in the 1980s and early 1990s. But then later, the CBDB people made use of basically machine reading strategies to go through a very large biographical dictionary of the Song dynasty and absorb all of that data as well. So this brings in certain sorts of data for the Song and certain sorts of data for the Tang. And let me say a little bit more about the Tang data then. So the Tang data then comes mainly from my own databases. There's a couple of versions of it now available on my webpage. The version 1.5 has more data. Version 1 is still useful to look at the queries that I produced in association with my first book, but basically the version 1.5 is more extensive, and one has well over 30,000 individuals in the database. The source of this, I pulled the data from a number of different sources. One of them was the genealogical tables of the imperial clan and families of chief ministers in the New Tang history. This brought in maybe 18,000 individuals, and also brought in lots of genealogical information of how one individual is related to another individual. I also made use of biographies from the dynastic histories. I was systematic in using 9th century ones, less systematic in earlier periods. And then I also make extensive use of excavated tomb epitaphs. That is, these biographies carved onto stone that have been dug out of tombs, mainly in North China, but also in other parts of China in recent decades. And this has really been a treasure trove for Tang historians in terms of providing all of this new biographical data. My own database has focused on the 9th century, though I did also collect data from certain periods in earlier times to get some sense of what was happening over the course of the Tang dynasty. Now, one point I want to make, and I think this is, again, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I want to point out one way in which one can consider how the Tang data and the Song data is somewhat different in nature. And that has to do with the biographical data that comes from epitaphs. So in the Tang period, one mainly has excavated epitaphs, which one can imagine being representing more or less, a roughly random sample from specific regions. Archaeologists kind of randomly encounter tombs and excavate them and then recover the epitaphs. In contrast to the Song dynasty, in which case most epitaphs actually come from literary collections. And so you end up with lots of epitaphs written by a single individual. And one of the consequences of that is that you do, if you were to produce some sort of social network and compare the Tang to the Southern Song especially, where you really have the majority of epitaphs that come from collected works, what you would find is that the network I'm using in this slide here is just purely for an illustration. It's not something I produced based on the data itself, but the basic idea is that a network that is produced from Southern Song epitaphs, that is epitaphs from collected works, would tend to have a few prominent hubs, which would basically be the authors of the collected works, who are very well connected to a number of different individuals. By contrast, a network reconstructed, a social network reconstructed from data in the Tang excavated epitaphs is less likely to have these hubs. It's more likely to be a more diffuse network simply because of the sorts of the data, that the source of the fundamental source of the data in question. So this is just a point I think is important to make. One of a couple points I want to make about how one should use this data with caution. One should have a good understanding of the fundamental source of the data so that one can take into consideration how the nature of the sources might variably impact the sorts of calculations one might make, especially when one is comparing two different periods of time. Now, the sort of information that is recorded in both of these databases is the sorts of information one would expect to find in biographies and in tomb epitaphs. One has the place of origin of the individual. I want to stress that here one has an interesting contrast as well between the Tang and the Song. There's a tendency for the place of origin in Song times to actually be where the individual was from. In the case of the Tang, the place of origin is very, very often a place of ancestral origin where, the individual's, eighth generation ancestor might have been the last person to actually live there. And I think this is important to note as well, that place of origin can be problematic, especially in Tang data. Another example of the sorts of distinctions that might exist between the data itself when comparing the Tang and the Song. Besides that, one also finds information on immediate patrilineal male ancestors. One finds information about the official career of individuals. And if the data is from tomb epitaphs, one finds information about age at death, number of children, day and place of death and burial. There's eulogistic language that praises individuals, and that can then itself be analyzed, can be treated as a source of data. And then there are also, to some extent, one can reconstruct marriage partners. It's usually, more often than not, it's disappointing because when the spouse is identified, very often there's insufficient information to actually figure out who that person is. The best example would be if a male's wife is simply referred to as Miss Lee, for example. One would never know who she is the daughter of. One would never know which family she comes from just based on that information. So it's often disappointing, but sometimes one can actually figure out exactly who married, whose son married whose daughter. And this is very useful for reconstructing marriage networks. Let me say then a little bit about a few of the ways in which this sort of prosopographic data has been used for the study of the Tang and the Song. I want to bring up to begin with a relatively early study by Yaoping that went into historical demographics. She collected all of this data from the Tang period, looked at average age of death over time, compared males to females, looked at the number of children people were having, and she got some very interesting data. It should, of course, be noted that these epitaphs represent some sort of socioeconomic elite. Not every tomb had an epitaph. It was, a tomb that belonged to a family that had, more money, that had the economic wherewithal to, fund a more elaborate burial. I like to think of basically tombs with epitaphs as representing some sort of socioeconomic elite. And that's worth bearing in mind. So for example, if looking at the number of children, it is likely that these are families that had more children. Very practically speaking, the male elites were more likely to have concubines, and they were therefore more likely to have offspring, or they were likely to have a larger number of offspring in consequence. And so that's, something to bear in mind. Now, here is an interesting change over time. It's an example of how things developed over the course of the Tang Dynasty or across the Tang Song period. According to this data, one can see that the average age of women declined. The average age of death of women declined over the course of the Tang Dynasty. But here, I think it's worth paying attention to another factor that one should take into consideration when examining historical data, and that is, to what extent are we getting the full data set, and to what extent is there something else happening that is perhaps leading to, is perhaps having a surprising impact on the outcome. So what could explain the declining average age at death of women across the Tang Dynasty? One could say something was happening that was actually causing women to die at a younger age, but one should also bear in mind the absence of data. Maybe what was in fact happening is that women who died younger in the earlier period were not being recorded, were not given epitaphs. And that is how I would I would tend to explain this sort of data, that in fact, if one looks at the early Tang epitaphs for women, the age distribution of death, and then one compares that to the late Tang, one compares early Tang to late Tang, what one notices is that the early Tang lacks this first hump, and that is women who died in childbirth. In pre-modern times, this was a very large number of women died in childbirth, and that hump at the younger age does not appear in the earlier data. And so indeed, it's likely that what's happening is that women who died in childbirth were simply not given tomb epitaphs in the early period. But for some reason, something changed in the culture that made them more important, and more, from the perspective of the family, became more important to write an epitaph, even in these cases. So this is a point that I think is worth making, an example of how historical data should be used carefully, because one should bear in mind what is missing as well as what is actually included. What are some of the other conclusions one might draw? This is an interesting pattern I noticed some time ago, and I can't really, I don't have a really good explanation, and I didn't develop this into anything particularly interesting, but this shows the month of death in 9th century epitaphs from Luoyang. So again, these are elites. This would be the socioeconomic elite. Many of these people, a substantial percentage of these people, in fact, were office holders. They were bureaucrats serving in the Tang administration. So they were powerful as well as wealthy. It's interesting that basically more of them are dying in the 5th, 6th, and 7th month than in the, say, 11th, 12th, 2nd, and 3rd month. So there seems to be a higher death rate in summer than in winter. And one could, posit that this is plausibly the consequence of infectious diseases that are circulating in summer. It is possible that that if one were to look at non-elites rather than elites, that there would be more death in winter as a consequence of starvation, perhaps a problem that it does not impact elites. I don't have a full solution to explain this data, but it's interesting to note these sorts of things one can learn about the people living in this early period on the basis of this very large data set that survives. Here's another interesting study by Claire Yang in her dissertation looking at death ritual in the Tang Dynasty. Also showing some of the interesting conclusions one can draw from this very large data set. In this case, she was looking at the day of burial of an individual in the 60-day cycle, and found that certain days were clearly more frequently used than others. Out of a sample of 2,700 epitaphs, you had a few days that represented about nearly 50% of burials. Nearly 50% of burials took place on one of 5 days in the 60-day cycle, suggesting clearly, this is statistically significant without any doubt, and it suggests that certain days, one can get a sense of how people were making, how elites in this period were making decisions based on the auspiciousness of a day in determining when to bury their dead. Here's another example of what one could do, and in this case using eulogistic language. This is something I've been working on pretty recently. The idea is basically to look at the language of epitaphs and to look at how it changes between the Tang and the Song period. And the idea really is to use this change in language in order to trace some kind of change in mentality between the Tang and the Song. So part of my study involved identifying specific terms that were much more common in the earlier period in the Tang dynasty, certain terms that were much more common in by the Song dynasty, and to see to what extent one could use this change in discourse and explain it on the basis of a shift from an aristocratic ethos in the Tang to a more meritocratic ethos in the Song. I do think one can indeed use this shift in discourse in this way. So I produced long lists of words that were part of the older discourse and long lists that were part of the new discourse, based on Python scripts that were comparing the epitaph texts. And then I could use this data also to calculate the change over time, so one could see how epitaphs changed in their language. And it's really, the dynamics are quite interesting. And this reflects an important shift in discourse between the Tang and the Song. You have this new discourse emerging quite dramatically around the turn of the 11th century, around the year 1000. It's interesting that there was this older discourse. There was already experimentation with the newer discourse in the older period, in the writings, and this is it's well known, the influence of some of the Wenji authors of the 9th century, like Han Yu, on the later prose writers of the 11th century. And we can see this, the impact on this data here in the form of this surge in this new discourse in the 9th century. But what's interesting and important to note is that the excavated epitaphs maintain the old discourse. We really get a sense of how Han Yu and his and other Wenji authors of the 9th century were unusual. We're doing something completely different and completely at odds with the rest of elite society. The vast majority of epitaphs written for very prominent people in the Tang dynasty in the 9th century made use of the older discourse, but all of the epitaphs, both the excavated ones and the ones from Wenji, surge in their use of new discourse by the 11th century. At this point, one can conclude that the Wenji authors are no longer anomalous. They are really representing a trend that is sweeping across society at this particular period in time. Okay, now I want to move more in the direction of a particular topic that I want to focus on for the remainder of the time, and that has to do with the structure of the elite and also the structure of the way that the empire is organized. So the data from these prosopographic databases can be used, as I suggested, to reconstruct marriage networks. I will note that only a very small percentage of marriages can be identified. I explained the problem that even when the spouse is named, very often you can't connect that person to another family. You can't figure out who that person is. And so it ends up being, in some sense, a dead link from the purposes of our data. But what you can do, you have enough of these marriages that if instead of looking at individual marriages, you look at marriages between families, then you can start to detect interesting patterns. And I suggest, and so this diagram here is basically showing marriage ties between individual families. I refer to them as patrilines, and basically I define a patriline in the case of my study as basically all of the network of kin that can be connected by verifiable father-son connections. So one can find hard data suggesting that these individuals are linked together. It's not based on simply claiming a surname, claiming a particular place of origin. A patriline I define as, a genealogical group that one has a certain degree of certainty really was a coherent unit. Now, these patrilines then, of course, are reconstructed. You could imagine each of these circles on this diagram representing a patriline. Each of them itself would represent a family tree, and so I suggested that with that red arrow. I reconstructed one family tree and then pointed to the particular circle that represents that family tree to give you a sense of how this works. Now, on the basis of this, then one can find a relatively dense marriage network. This is a network that represents the political elite of the Tang Dynasty. A remarkable percentage of known office holders come from one of the families, one of the patrilines depicted on this diagram. A considerable number of the cultural elite, famous poets like Du Fu and Bai Jiri are also included in this diagram. They come from families that are represented on this network. And so what one sees here is really, one can visualize by this means the political elite, the cultural elite, the social elite of the Tang Dynasty, and one can see how they are closely interconnected with each other. I did find it interesting, and this was not something that I expected to find. This is based on research from my first book. I identified two pretty obvious clusters or cliques in this network, one on the left, one on the right. And it's interesting to think about what this might imply about the structure of an elite at this time. So this cluster on the left is basically the imperial clan is at the center, and these are all of the families that are intermarrying with the imperial clan. So this represents one facet of the political elite of this period. And then on the right, one has a different cluster. These are very prominent old families. These are the black circles represent families that belong to the so-called marriage, or that are among the so-called marriage ban clans. These are the most eminent families that in the early Tang Dynasty, Tang Taizong attempted to ban intermarriages, ban these families from intermarrying with each other, hence the name the marriage ban clans. And this, of course, only contributed to further enhancing their prestige. And so here you see them. You can see that they maintained their prominence, and they maintained their prominence at some distance from the imperial clan. They had their own base of power that was rooted in this marriage network. Many members of these clans served in very high offices, including offices that worked to reproduce the bureaucracy, the chief ministers, the ministers of personnel, the people who actually made decisions on who would be the next generation of bureaucrats. They came from these families, helping to explain how a network like this could serve the practical purpose of reproducing these families in power. So I think that this is interesting to note. We can see how there was this aristocracy that was at some distance from the imperial clan itself. There was also a geographic dimension to this political elite. So to begin with, nearly all of these families were based in what I refer to as the capital corridor, that is the broad geographic region between Chang'an and Luoyang, including some of the surrounding prefectures. This was the center of political power. This was where these families were based. Even the families that claimed ancestral origins in Hebei, for example, or somewhere even in the south, in fact, if they had political power in the Tang, they tended to have relocated to the capital, either Chang'an or Luoyang, generations earlier. One can see this geographic distribution on the basis of this diagram. The L refers to Luoyang, so all of the black circles represent families based in Luoyang. One can see that the most preeminent of the aristocratic families were Luoyang based, whereas the families that were intermarrying with the imperial clan were based either in Chang'an, which is marked by a C, or somewhere in between, or sometimes in Chang'an, sometimes in Luoyang, which is denoted with a CL. So we can see on the one hand there is a geographic segregation between these two clusters, but the other conclusion to draw is that all of these families, regardless of which of the cliques they belong to, were based in the capital region. And we can see then the importance of the capital for the Tang in other ways as well. This table was compiled on the basis of tomb epitaphs. The idea is to get some kind of cross-section of the capital elite in 3 time periods by basically looking at all epitaphs that date to particular slices of time, all epitaphs I could find that were published in any collection. And one can see certain tendencies. So one looks at the very first row, I identify strong office holding traditions. That is when, if you look at the individual, or if it's a woman, her husband, and then one looks at the son, the father, and the grandfather, if out of those 4 generations, 3 of them have identifiable offices, then that would be a strong tradition. So the idea is families that occasionally you had someone who didn't serve, often because they died young, but usually most generations served. This was a family with a strong office holding tradition, and one can see that in fact these capital-based families were predominantly, the elite buried in the capital consisted predominantly of office holders, of office holding families. That they really dominated the landscape, the social landscape at the capital. And I won't go through all of these rows, but I think that they all serve to corroborate this basic point. Okay, so now I want to move on to say something about how things changed between the Tang and the Song in this regard. And I want to also at this point bring up a thesis that is associated with Robert Hartwell and Robert Himes, that is the localism thesis, because it's interesting to think about how this is reflected in this particular data. So the idea behind the localism thesis is that, basically, whereas you once had an elite that was of national significance, that specialized in office holding, that really looked like the people that I've just been describing, who dominated politics during the Tang period. By the time you get to the Southern Song, so at the end of a long period of time between the Tang and the second half of the Song, you have a very different sort of political elite, very it's unusual for families by the Southern Song to specialize in office holding. Instead of being based at the capital, they're more likely to be based in on some estate in the provinces at some remove from the capital. These families no longer specialize in office holding. They do a variety of different things. They'll even get involved in commerce, a number of possible pursuits. So this is a long-term phenomenon that has been described by past historians. And I thought it would be interesting then to take a look at the geography of this and to get a sense of, how is this reflected if one actually tries to map out this phenomenon. So the way I did this, the way I approached the problem was to look at basically where were the family members of the highest officials buried? Where were the families based that produced the highest officials, the most prominent officials in the bureaucracy? And so on this map, one can see these are all these are basically represent each of the circles, and the larger circle, of course, represents more burials, but each of them represents a place of burial of someone who belongs to one of these clans that produced chief ministers. So these are from the chief ministers' families. Where were they buried? And one sees this incredible concentration in the capital. In the capital region. The two large circles represent Chang'an to the west and Luoyang to the east. It is interesting to note that Luoyang, despite not being the supreme capital, not being the Shangjing of the Tang, it nevertheless, in fact, was a more important center of this political elite. Luoyang was more important partly because it was the base of power of these older aristocratic families that were maintaining some remove from the imperial family itself. So one can see very clearly that these were families that were buried in the capital region, either at one of these two capital cities or in the region in between. There are a few stray dots elsewhere, and each of these represents some unique situation that is exceptional, but really one can see an extraordinary concentration in this capital region. What I did then was to basically define the region in which you have the most powerful political elite, that is the region where you have based the families producing the most powerful decision makers in the Chinese bureaucracy. I defined this as the metropole, which is, a term used to talk about sort of the imperial center, the center of an empire. And so the metropole then would be the region which has this concentration of political elites. And I've marked it here. It basically represents the prefectures that are in the immediate vicinity of the two capitals of Chang'an and Luoyang. These are so this would be the capital corridor. I refer to this region as the capital corridor. And then the blue circles here represent offices, provincial offices that these same families were basically serving in. So people within these families that were producing chief ministers, where were they serving in provincial offices? And one sees that indeed they were serving all over the empire. So it's important to note that this was an elite that was, nationally significant. It was an elite that was based in the capital, but really had political authority in the aggregate over the entire empire. They were really at the heart of the imperial bureaucracy. And here it's worth comparing then this capital elite to the provincial elite. So the provincial elite, when you do find epitaphs in the provinces rather than epitaphs in the capital, and when you do, studies of the prosopographic studies of these people who are represented by these provincial epitaphs, one finds basically that they were of a different sort, especially as one got into the 9th century towards the of the Tang Dynasty, one finds that basically more and more of these provincial elites were serving locally. When they served in office, the offices they served in were in lower echelon positions within these provincial administrations. So by the second half of the Tang, there was a parallel administration that was established. This was sometimes they're referred to as the military administrations or the Jiedushi administrations. There's various ways of referring to them. I tend to in English to refer to them simply as the provincial administration, but I draw a distinction between that and the regular bureaucracy. The regular bureaucracy was staffed predominantly by people who came from capital-based families, but the provincial bureaucracies at the lower level, the lower echelon positions, increasingly by the second half of the 8th century into the 9th century, were staffed by locals. These lower echelon positions then were not positions that could be used for promotion to higher office. You were really stuck. It was a dead-end career, if you will, to be in one of these offices. The upper echelon positions in the provincial bureaucracies, they were predominantly occupied by people from the capital-based families, and these were positions that did actually lead to fast-track promotions within the regular bureaucracy. So you have this very interesting divide. The lower echelon positions were staffed by locals, the upper echelon by people from the capital. So one sees this remarkable division between capital-based elites and provincial elites. One way I think of conceptualizing this, and this is kind of a provocative thing to say, but I think it can be useful to think of this as basically the Tang metropole colonizing the provincial periphery. It's really a metropole-centered elite that is projecting its power over this huge empire, and the provincial elites are simply the subjects of this imperial power that is dominated again by the capital elite. Now, what happens in the Song dynasty is somewhat, one can see some interesting developments. So in the case of the Song dynasty, rather than looking at, for the Tang dynasty, I was making use of my own data, the data I collected that I described earlier in this talk. When I got to the Song dynasty, I was making use of CBDB data. So I was making use of data compiled, originally by Hartwell, but then developed by the many people involved in the CBDB project. And I was looking at, rather than family members of chief ministers, I was looking at a broader group, that is family members of people who served on the Council of State, the number of offices at the top of the bureaucracy that would in principle, where the occupant would have met with, the incumbent would have met with the emperor on a daily basis to discuss policy. So I think of these people as as the height of the political elite. So the question was, where are their families buried? When you find epitaphs for individuals who are related to someone who served on the Council of State, where were they buried? And I use this as a proxy to figure out where the home base of these families. And on the basis of that, one can see, first of all, that it's much less concentrated in the capital region. Already by the Northern Song, one can see, in some sense, a geographic expansion in regions that had elites that could plausibly produce someone who would make it to the pinnacle of the bureaucracy. So there was some sort of opening up of the bureaucracy in a geographic sense by the Northern Song. It has been noted, however, that probably, at least in period of time in kind of the early to mid 11th century, there probably was a movement towards the capital. There was a general process by which families were generally relocating to the capital, and there may have ultimately been perhaps a new capital elite would have developed, but in the end, this did not happen. I mark here two regions that I think have somewhat greater concentrations of elite. And so there is a greater concentration in the region between Luoyang and Kaifang. These are the two capitals of the Song dynasty. And then there's also an interesting concentration of people in the lower Yangtze River. And so I have propose that we treat these two regions as the metropole of the Northern Song. And then once again, I drew a similar map to what I produced for the Tang Dynasty to suggest that these people then were serving all over the empire. So people from families based in this metropole region, from these very prominent families, were again serving all over the empire. Some of you will note some interesting circles, that little blue dots that are way out west. These are probably errors. There's a few place names that could be more than one, that could be situated in more than one place. And as I was processing this data in this very large amount of data, there's a little bit of noise that you can detect, which is, kind of these erroneous dots that are far to the west. I think they can basically be ignored. There's so much data that one can, focus on what's important, which is the fact that you have these people serving all over the territory of the Northern Song. And then finally, we get to the Southern Song. And in the Southern Song, I think one can see a further expansion in terms of the geographic spread of the political elite, the distribution of the families that produced the very most powerful officials is a bit more spread out across the territory of the Southern Song, and I've proposed these. I've drawn out the metropole once more to suggest what was the core political region of the Southern Song. Now, looking at this map, one may not be struck by the extent to which this represented something fundamentally different. It's true that there's still large swaths of territory of the Southern Song where one cannot detect anywhere in the historical records or in the archaeological records any sign of families that produced the top elite. And so one could, draw the conclusion that maybe this doesn't represent something fundamentally different. But if one then maps the Southern Song metropole, let me just quickly show you this map to be consistent, so that you can again see where these people are serving. So they're serving all over the territory of the Southern Song, and some of them served in office prior to the Jurchen invasion, and so you can see dots in the North China as well. But what I wanted to stress was that if you look at the metropole and you map it onto a population map, basically a map of population density, then it is striking that what I'm defining as the metropole of the Southern Song does, to a considerable extent, coincide with the most dense population region, the regions of densest population in the Southern Song. By contrast, in the Northern Song, there wasn't the same overlap between the political elite and the places of highest population density. I will note that at the center of the capital metropole of the Northern Song, there is a white shape, and this is an error. This is Kaifeng, and basically the data I was using to do population, it left out the population of Kaifeng. So I probably should have just manually colored it in as dark green. But in any case, I don't think it, even if we take that aside, we ignore that little problem, I think we can still see something very different when comparing the Northern Song and the Southern Song. And this can then also be depicted graphically. One can basically look at the percentage of the Chinese population residing in the metropole. So rather than looking kind of visually at how the metropole overlaps with, a map of population density. One can look at basically what was the population in terms of households of the prefectures that were parts of the metropole in the Tang, the Northern Song, and the Southern Song, and compare that to the total population. For the Tang, although my data, which really showed this concentration of people in the capital dated to the 9th century, the reliable population figures date to the 8th century. So I was using 8th century population figures. And one can find that, on the order of 13% of the population, of the registered population of the Tang Empire lived in the metropole, that is, lived in the geographic zone that produced families, that produced the people who then served in the highest offices of the bureaucracy. In the Northern Song, in fact, one has a relatively similar figure, around 13% of the population of the Northern Song lived in the metropole. But when you get to the Southern Song, you see something very different. There you see well over 50% of the population resided in the region, in what I define as the metropole, that is the geographic zone that produced the top elites. And I think it's interesting then to think about what this suggests. If one wants to say that the Tang was an empire that was basically colonizing the provinces, where a metropole-based elite was serving as the tools of empire, projecting projecting authority all across the provinces. By the Southern Song, you have a very different situation where more and more of the population in the provinces actually lived in areas where there were families that were producing, top imperial elites. I would suggest this represented really a very different sort of empire. Probably it's not necessary to go into too much detail, but there are various ways in which people have attempted to define an empire. What is an empire? How do you distinguish an empire from a mere state? The less interesting definition, in my view, is to say empires are big, states are small. I think it's more interesting to think of some kind of analytical difference. And I think that the distribution, the concentration of power, the geographic concentration of power is a plausible definition of empire, where empires basically consist of political entities where one geographic zone monopolizes political power and exerts power over other territories. And if one thinks of a definition of empire in this sense, then one could even go on to say that the Southern Song was less of an empire. It was more of a state in, in some sense, in the modern sense of state, some sort of state that was much more representative of the entire population and was not structured around these imperial concentrations of power in a political center. So I think I'll stop here. I am very eager to hear the comment from Professor Wang, and then also I'm very eager to hear any of your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Tekich. Well, now we invite Professor Eric Wang from Australia National University Political Science Department to give about 15 minutes discussion before we came to pick audience question. Okay, Eric?
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
So thank you, Zhiwu and Chicheng, for the invitation, and thank you, Nick, for sharing with us your fascinating work. Let me start by emphasizing that the Quantitative History webinar shares and promotes studies from any discipline that uses quantitative historical data, and is by construction, by definition, a true interdisciplinary community. I cannot think of a more fitting and distinguished scholar to present here than Nick Tackett. Right. His remarkable work, which seamlessly bridges the gap between disciplines, epitomizes the essence of interdisciplinary research and exemplifies the kind of spirit of collaboration that is the cornerstone of this seminar. I'm also personally a huge fan of Nick Tackett's work. I've read all his works more than once. So it's a tremendous privilege for me to serve as Nick's discussant today. So in case you don't know, in case any of the audience don't know yet, since the publication of his groundbreaking 2014 book, scholars across social science disciplines, political scientists, economists, and sociologists alike have been experiencing a kind of dream come true moment for their, especially for those who use historical data, right, for their careers, because Nick has made public available such important fine-grained micro data conducive to rigorous quantitative social science analysis. I myself also an active user of his data. So I want to further thank Nick for uncovering, digitizing, and making publicly available such data. It reflects an exceptional commitment to open science and interdisciplinary collaboration, right? So, and I also want to highlight, just in case a lot of audience don't know, right? Nowadays, there are multiple proprietary databases, by proprietary, I mean you can purchase with subscription online that aim to cover the near universe of the text in Tang and Song dynasty, especially Northern Song dynasty epitaphs, right? And the availability of these online resources make things look easy, right? But these tools were not available at all when Nick was writing his dissertation in early 21st century and his book in the 2010s, right? So Nick had to actually travel around China to visit local museums and obtain access to the epitaph stone slabs and manually enter all the info, right? So this is an extremely arduously long process and took an extraordinary amount of effort. And I'm qualified to say this because I work across these databases as well as Nick's data. So I can say that even today, this is not a huge number anymore, but there are still a small number of epitaphs in Nick's databases that do not really exist online, right? That you cannot access with some purchase subscription. So that tells us a lot about Nick's tremendous effort when he was doing this kind of work, right? So I want to talk about, so I have like two main comments. One is on the sources of epitaphic data, which Nick has talked to us a lot about in the beginning of his presentation. So what we notice is that there's something really strange that happened in the 10th century that essentially affected the sources of data, right? So before the 10th century, the majority of epitaphic texts that exist today, right? They come from excavated epitaphs, right? The kind of epitaphic texts that existed in the collections of works by famous people like Han Yu, like Bai Juyi, like Li Shangyin, right? They are only a minority of the epitaph texts, right? Most of the texts are like they exist and like beneath the ground, and then in 20th century there are a lot of excavation, so they got those, right? And then starting in the Northern Song until and all the way down the second millennium, starting in the Northern Song, most of the, I wouldn't say most, but at least the vast majority of epitaphic texts actually exists in these collective works by famous poets and famous authors. You actually don't get a lot of excavated epitaphs, right? Which is interesting and strange, right? So I wonder why. And this obviously affects how much the credibility of using epitaphic data to conduct sort of a demographic analysis or sociological analysis, right? Like it doesn't necessarily affect the credibility of political analysis if we only focus on the top level officials, right? Like Nick has done today by showing us the variation in the geography of power from the town to the Song, right? But it does affect anyone who studies demography or social mobility if she or he uses epitaphic texts from the Song Dynasty, for example, because most of them are exist not through excavated stones, but through these collected works, which will have a higher risk of selection bias, right? Because if you're a friend of these high-level officials or famous poets, these identities sometimes overlap in the Northern Song, right? Then you are more likely to enter the data. So Nick, I'm sure you're aware of Tomoyasu Iyama's work using data from stone slabs in the Yuan dynasty, talking about social mobility and political mobility in the Yuan dynasty northern elites, right? So there, for example, even though the book and other articles claim that these data come from epitaphic texts, most of the data actually come from the epitaphic texts that exist in the collected works, not really the actual stones, right? So when I read his work, I basically adjust my confidence a little bit, right? Like because of the issues that Nick and I have been talking about. So I want to ask Nick, sort of what do you think is the reason why there's such a big transformation, not in terms of not just in terms of power economy during the Tang and Song, but really transformation in terms of the sources of epitaphic data, right? So my second comment is on the way you construct networks, right? So it's about how agnostic we want to be, right? So for those in the audience who don't know, I want to emphasize another major contribution of Nick's work that basically a lot of people don't really understand, like how big the contribution is, right? So Nick is not the first historian who uses biographic quantitative or digitized data to study the Tang Dynasty. It's not. Like we can think of Johnson, we can think of the Chinese historian Mao Hanguang and others, right? But Nick is the first in two things, right? First is that he digitizes the epitaphic data, which is a tremendous contribution I've already emphasized. Another of his contribution that people who don't study Tang Dynasty don't really understand, but is a hugely important contribution, is that the people who used quantitative data before Nicholas Tackett, when they studied the aristocracy, what they did is that they predefined what aristocracy is, right? In terms of whether you have father and grandfather who serve in the high offices, in terms of whether you came from a prominent coronym, which became problematic in the Tang Dynasty, right? And then they predefine what that is, and then they look at, how that identity sort of perform in terms of government offices in the Tang Dynasty, right? What Nick did is that he said, okay, I'm not gonna predefine what aristocracy is, right? What we know is that if someone is aristocrat, it must be that he or she at the time is seen as part of an elite society, right? So I'm gonna be totally agnostic and I'm gonna let the data tell us what an elite society looked like in the Tang Dynasty. And then he constructed these networks and boom, okay, the elite society looked like people who had already moved their ancestral graveyards to Chang'an and Luoyang. They intermarry each other, and then then their families dominated the political life in Chang'an and Luoyang, and to some extent the whole empire for generations, right? So that is a tremendously new thing that he has done as a historian to the historical literature, right? So that's why network analysis, the way Nick does, is extremely important. So I have, and then my question about the way you use network analysis is the following, right? So in the Tang Dynasty, you basically plotted networks with these petri lines, and then the graph, right? The graph itself looks like there are two clusters, okay? But if you actually use a principal statistical algorithm, such as the Lovong algorithm, for example, to detect the number of communities, the number is not 2, it's usually 5 or 3. It's not 2, right? So there you have a discrepancy between what we can learn visually from the network graph and what the statistical methods would tell us, right? So there, right, I trust your visual decision because it makes a lot of sense, right? Because it perfectly sort of lines up the Guanlong group versus the Shandong group, the Chang'an plus Luoyang based group and the pure Luoyang based group, and then you have Niu Sengru in one group and Li Deyu in the other group. So they all lined up with our prior theoretical expectations. So in other words, in your case on the Tang Dynasty, I trust your visual decision over the statistical decision, not because of any agnostic story the data tells us, because agnostically they tell us that there are more than two communities, right? But because I do have a prior, and then your thing is in line with the prior, right? So this kind of way to sort of reconcile between the discrepancies becomes a little problematic when we study other dynasties where we don't have much of a prior, where we have to rely on data agnostically. So for example, if you do the same thing for the Song dynasty, if you do the same thing for Southern Song, if you do the same thing for the Ming dynasty, for example, right, you won't get a very clear cut two clusters, even though the number of communities is higher than two, right? You will get like a bunch of like clusters, just like the map you showed us, right? You get a bunch of clusters. So then it's actually hard for us to tell visually how many actual cliques are there. Then you would rely on the algorithms that detect communities, which will give you like a very high number, right? Sometimes you get 41 communities, right? So how do you deal with that, right? And I think for the interest of time, these are my main two comments. Not really comments, but really just some questions reflect my own intellectual curiosity. And I think all of us continue to have a lot to learn from Nick's fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. So Professor Tackett, would you like to respond briefly?
Yeah. Thank you. Those are very interesting questions, and I don't think there's time to really go into the details that they warrant. I'll just say a couple of things very briefly regarding the change in the excavated versus epitaphs from literary collections. I do think that there's two factors here. One is that literary collections survive much better after printing, and so looking at from the perspective of why are there epitaphs from literary collection more in the Song, that's of course straightforward. The question about why are there fewer excavated ones, that's the more interesting question. I don't really have an answer, but I do think that it's impacted by how archaeologists do their job. I do think there's a sense in China that archaeology kind of ends with the Tang Dynasty, and in the Song you enter a whole new era where there's printed sources that tell you much more than what the archaeologists can say. I looked once at the archaeological yearbook and just did some rough counts, and it's very clear that there's way more that's published on the warring state, the Zhou dynasty, the warring states, the Han, the Tang, and then there's a huge drop. And of course, there's plenty of stuff that's found that dates to the Song, Ming, Qing, but it's just not interesting enough. There's so much stuff in China that's excavated. The more interesting stuff ends up being the older stuff. And I think there's a cutoff between the Tang and the Song, so that Song stuff isn't published. I've found Song epitaphs in museums, and I found one from a very prominent family. It was it was Hu Su's brother, so someone who was like from a prominent family. If that had been a Tang epitaph, it would have been published. It was Song, it was not published. Nobody's interested. Now, the second question about statistics, basically, I don't think there's time really to answer it. I agree that basically it was a special case. The Tang case was special where, it was visually obvious. It was just clear that there was this division that was worth mentioning. You could see that there were other communities that one could talk about, but this was two important components that was visually obvious. I think that the statistics, are the ways of doing statistical calculations to determine communities are invaluable. I'm very happy people are using them, but I am sometimes suspicious of people who, basically use very sophisticated statistics to determine something that you don't really need them to determine. And so I think in this particular case, I felt very comfortable just saying, look, we can see that we can see what's going on. And it was surprising to me. I did not think there would be such a clear division between the Shandong group and the Guangdong group. It surprised me. And it was cool that it was there. It was so visually obvious. But I agree that going into the Song and other dynasties, one would have to use a different strategy. And there's more it would be great to have a longer conversation, but I think we're going to have to stop here. Thank you very much for that. Very, very thoughtful and very.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. Now let's pick up some questions from our audience. We received a couple of interesting questions. I will just take the liberty to pick some questions for Nick to answer, given the time limit. So first, I will repeat Sen Haohu's question. Dear Professor Tackett, thanks for your sharing. According to Chen Yinque, Chen Yinque's category, there was mainly two most important political organizations in the Sui and Tang dynasty, Guanlong organizations and the Shandong heroes. For example, Zhang Liang, one representative of Shandong heroes, was employed by Li Shiming to control Luoyang in early Tang. So I just wonder if the elite distribution network and the marriage patterns you just described, one clustered in Chang'an and the other in Luoyang in Tang, has any relationship with the evolution of these two organizations? Yeah.
So the brief answer is absolutely. I think that it absolutely reflects that. It's good corroborating evidence for precisely what he was talking about. And again, the data I show is really more concentrated on the 9th century. So what's interesting is to see that this survives clear into the 9th century, which did surprise me. I really didn't think it would. I was actually, to be honest, I was a little suspicious of these geographic categories to begin with. It just seemed a little too neat a model to actually, show up in the messy data that one can compile on the basis of the historical records. But indeed, we see that it works very well, and so we really get a sense of Chen Yinque's really good intuition and broad knowledge and really good sense of what was going on in the Tang Dynasty. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Well, the next question is from Professor Claire Young from Washington University. Dear Professor Tackett, thanks for the fabulous talk. I wonder the transition of an Tang Empire to a Song state. Do you think it's driven by population mobility and the end of North Song, which reshuffled the elite distribution, or a new bureaucratic selection scheme adopted by the South Song, or both? In other words, do you think the dynamics of state building has changed during the North to South Song transition?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say. It's very plausible. I guess my first answer to the explanation of what's happening is simply to refer back to the way the Northern Song Southern Song transition is described by Hartwell and then Himes. I think that the general idea that, I think Hartwell especially made a bigger deal about factionalism at court that basically gave elites pause about whether they really wanted to specialize in office holding. That's a theory I'm a little less attracted to. But the basic idea that so many people, the exam was, relatively open. And so many people had the resources to get educated by the late Northern Song that you just had a huge competition for offices. There were more and more more and more families who could plausibly serve in office, which created a situation that was simply impossible for any one family to think that they could actually succeed by specializing in office holding. My tendency would be to kind of roll with that thesis, but I think that it's the kind of problem that is surely explained by a number of different factors. It's the sort of problem that, as with any complex historical question, surely there's multiple parts to the explanation. I think that what you're proposing is very possible and certainly worth thinking more about.
Well, thank you. Well, the next from H.J. Wang, thanks for your interesting talk. You give examples of the usage of data in interpreting Tang, Northern Song, and the Southern Song periods. I wonder if you have ever used the data to study the 5 dynasties period in particular. If so, any interesting findings? Thanks.
Yeah, the 5 dynasties, it's actually, I'm working on the 10th century with, that's sort of the focus of my interests right now, is specifically the 10th century, not necessarily 5 dynasties, but I look broad period between 880 and 980. I think of it as the century when the region of China proper, say, was broken up among a number of different regimes, and I think it's very interesting to examine what was going on. I think that the fact that there existed a number of regional courts was important. It produced a certain sort of dynamics whereby you could have, essentially you could have a larger imperial elite, because each of the different imperial courts was basically duplicating certain basic functions of the others, and so you had more opportunities for a broader assortment of people to get offices in these regional courts. That was important. But there's a lot of factors. I think also the migration during the period in the 5 dynasties, in the 10th century, migration was also important, and specifically elite migration, that you could see that individuals were moving around in huge numbers. They were you had these educated elites who were accompanying armies and moving around the empire. So there was lots going on in the 10th century. There's a little bit less data. There's fewer, epitaphs, relatively speaking, that survive from this period. So it requires a different sort of methodology. But there's a lot of potential. Looking forward to learning more. Thank you for the question.
Okay, good. Perhaps the last question from Duancheng Yang. Dear Professor Tackett, thank you for your sharing. I'm curious about the biography from historical document, and the epitaphs are sometimes different and even contradictory. How to solve this problem? Thank you.
Yeah, so there are contradictions. My approach, I tend to sort of ignore the details, in order to look at the big picture. Some of the contradictions I don't worry too much about. A very common thing that I would encounter is, say, in the transmitted historical text, you might see that so and so is the father of, person A is the father of person B, and then when you find the epitaph, you find out that person A is the uncle of person B. And those sorts of details, basically, I find that to be not entirely resolvable. Probably the epitaph is more reliable, but there could be some reasons why the epitaph would modify the situation. But some of those problems, I think, get kind of erased by the data, because from my perspective, person A and person B are still part of the same patriline. It doesn't really matter. These little points of detail won't really have an impact on the big picture. But if you are interested in a very specific and trying to reconstruct a very specific event, then it is, it's an issue you have to deal with. And I think you have to just think about the different agendas. The transmitted text, there's a greater chance of error accruing as these texts get recopied in different formats. But then there's also different agendas that the historians writing the historical documents, they have an agenda. They're trying to further a particular vision of court. Kind of the court's perspective on power. They're looking for ways of making an argument about how to be more efficient in governance. So there is an agenda there. And then, of course, the epitaphs also have an agenda of promoting the prestige of the deceased family. So just weigh these different issues. But it is a tough thing to do. And so it's a very good question. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Tackett, for your answers. So lastly, Professor Zhu Chen, do you have any questions or comments?
I just have a very quick one. Thank you, Nick. So you showed us that from the Tang Dynasty to the northern Song and then the southern Song, the geographic distribution of the elite networks really spread outward. What outcome or what outcome variables would you use to sort of try to see what changes are the outward spreading of the networks really led to, whether we're talking about the political process or economic development outcomes, or what would be the outcomes you'd like us to pay attention to, right? So because if the spreading out of the elite networks did not really make any difference to the key outcomes for the larger society, then maybe we would say, well, okay, so be it. So let them do it.
Yeah, I don't know what the answer is to that. I see it more in terms of little stories one reads that are suggestive of how society might change. So by the Southern Song, you have stories of, a county magistrate who actually has to deal with some retired minister and has a little bit, you can detect a little bit less authority. There's a little bit of an issue because that minister is going to have connections back at the capital. So there's kind of a political dimension that becomes more complex and more difficult to manage, which gives you a sense, but it's more a qualitative, this is qualitative data rather than quantitative, that locals really do have a little bit more ability to stand up to the central bureaucracy. I've tried, I tried using metrics that were available that I just quickly came up with. So one of them is, okay, look for uprisings. There's some data on uprisings, and I didn't really find any correlation whatsoever. I found uprisings tended to happen kind of in non-state space, let's say. So there's an interesting dynamic that you could talk about, but it isn't really related to this phenomenon. It's not clear that it would, because these local elites are still in alliance with the state. So there's not particular reason to think that even though they can stand up to the state a little bit more, maybe that this would lead to anything. I also tried looking at basically temple inscriptions to see if the local elites were able to push their agendas to get local cults kind of state support. And there too, I didn't really find a good connection, although there were clear gaps in the data. There were entire regions that had no data. So there was some issue there. But I think, it would be interesting to see if there was a relationship to economic development or to tax receipts, per population, that if there are ways in which the elite was a little more successful at kind of keeping a greater percentage of the pie, if you will, of what's being collected, what would hypothetically should be collected from the land versus what is actually going to the state in terms of tax receipts. That could be something that would be measurable, that would be interesting. I would be very interested in any other metric you have in mind.
Okay, so we can count on our audience in our quantitative history webinar series. So they will take it on from here.
Great. And please let me know if there are interesting results.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And also thank you, Eric, for the wonderful discussion.
Okay, thank you again, Professor Tackett and Professor Eric Wang. Yeah.
Thank you.
Finally, let me announce the next event. Next Thursday, April 27, we will have Professor Ying Bai from Chinese University of Hong Kong to talk about his new study with Ray Xuejia on the idea mobilized people, the diffusion of communist ideology in early 20th century China. So welcome to attend. Thank you so much and see you next week. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.